Hello, I am your host, Naomi, and this is Mosaic in Progress. Content trigger warning for this episode for discussions of violence, terrorist acts, religious abuse, and LGBTQ related issues. And for those who find it triggering, also discussions of purity culture. Good morning. Or at least it's morning where I am recording. I woke up, as they say sometimes, with this on my heart and felt it needed to get out. We're a few days out now from the shooting at Club Q, and it has weighed on me heavily since I heard about it. My initial reaction when I heard about it obviously was grief and horror at the loss of lives, at the loss of safety, at just the horrific act of violence that was committed. And almost immediately, my conditioned brain went to what my parents' reaction would be. Growing up in the evangelical church, I learned very quickly that, according to them, God hates gay people. And I remember so vividly listening to my mother talk about what a disgusting lifestyle it was and how disgusting those people were. And it was one of the worst sins you can commit. And I remember asking her as a small child, like, even worse than murder? And she said, there's some things that God just calls abominations that are just worse than others, and that's one of them. Now, I won't get into the biblical accuracy, or rather inaccuracy of that, because that's not what I'm here to do, but I grew up thinking that homosexuality, being gay, was one of the worst things that a person could do. And if you ever decided to take that route, that you would probably never, ever get into heaven because you'd be so far gone that no one could reach you, because that's what my parents taught me. Now, I know not every Christian teaches their children this, and not every evangelical teaches their children this, but it is a prevalent enough ideology that I know that I am not isolated in this belief system that I was raised with. It is very common in the evangelical church to raise your children to believe that gay people are the absolute worst and God hates them. I was forced to end friendships when people came out. And there is something horribly traumatizing about being raised in a mentality where someone is so disgusting just because of a lifestyle they chose that you can't even associate with them. And I'm not talking about, quote, lifestyle choices where you're hurting other people, because this isn't. And I was raised to believe that AIDS was a punishment for gay people, and they were the reason that AIDS was a problem. And that is a mentality that even pervaded the medical community and still does to this day, where people think that AIDS only exists because of gay people. And growing up with this, I denied a huge aspect of myself because it was not safe to acknowledge it. And I think that a lot of people who grew up in this type of environment can relate, because when something about you is not safe, you just push it down. And it took me a long time to realize this as I grew into myself coming out of that environment when I finally moved out at 27. That there were so many parts of me that had just been hidden and shoved down, and I hadn't even realized that I had done that, but I had to survive. I was 12 years old the first time I consciously was attracted to another female. And I remember being so terrified that someone would find out. Even though I hadn't said it out loud, I hadn't even wrote it in my diary. I remember being so afraid someone would find out, because my parents literally said they would murder us if we were ever gay. Obviously not in those words. They didn't say murder. They just said they would kill us. They said there was nothing worse they could imagine happening, and we didn't deserve to live if we did that. And I shoved those feelings down. They were feelings that honestly should have been expected. I remember as a very young child just thinking that it made no sense that women married men, because men were just gross and women were beautiful with curves and boobs and long hair. And I thought, why in the world would someone really pretty not also want to be with someone really pretty? Why would they want to be with someone gross? I was probably about 7 or 8 when I thought that, and it just made no sense to me that men just missed out on all of the beauty, and women got all of it, and then women wouldn't want to be with someone who was also beautiful. And obviously my opinion on that changed, but at 12 years old, being attracted to another woman for the first time, I was terrified. And I dealt with those feelings for a couple of years, and eventually fully shoved them down after a confrontation my dad had about some other things in a pretty horrific episode of abuse. I shoved down everything about myself that I had been developing, and just became as dutiful a daughter as I could be. I developed Stockholm Syndrome pretty badly after that, and it was not until after I had moved out of their house that I really consciously acknowledged the feeling of being attracted to women again. I was 32 when I realized I was bisexual. And it's funny that I say I was 32 when I realized it, because I had been all along. I just refused to acknowledge it because it wasn't safe for me to do so. And even at 32, 5 years after being moved out of my parents' house, it still wasn't safe for me. I was terrified. I lost sleep a lot after I started coming out to people because I was so afraid that my parents would find out. Because I do truly believe, at least at that time, that they would have done something violent. And living in fear of being yourself is something that I think most people in the LGBTQ plus community relate to. Because for most of us, it has been a journey to self-discovery and self-expression and being authentic that we have had to hide so much of ourselves for so long that finally expressing yourself authentically is terrifying. And I think this is why places like Club Q exist, because there are still people out there who think that we deserve to die. And I have a friend who recently came out and started living with a woman, and she said that they will be harassed in public for holding hands, that people will shout things at them, people will throw things at them in restaurants, and it is 2022. And I think this is important to talk about because so many people think that fighting for rights and recognition is just trying to eliminate straight culture or something of that nature. And in fact, it is just trying to live. Just live and be left alone. And more needs to be done to change the culture, to change the acceptance, because it doesn't matter if someone's living how you want them to live, or believes how you want them to believe, or is different from you, or is the same as you. Everyone deserves an equal amount of protection and safety and freedom to just live their lives. Just because they don't look like you or think like you or live like you doesn't mean that they should not have a seat at the table next to you. And we have become so homogenized in our culture that we see anything different as unacceptable and something that needs to be weeded out. It reminds me of living with chickens growing up. If you've ever had chickens, you probably already know what I'm talking about. Chickens will attack another chicken if it's different. If it has a feather that's out of place, or a feather that's a different color, or a wound on it, or anything that's a little different, they'll peck it. And it starts out just pecking at it, just to pick at it. And they will peck a chicken to death. They will gang up on it and peck it to death, trying to get at the thing that's different and make it go away. And I think that we as a culture do exactly that. Anything that is different, we hate it. And we attack it until it's no longer different. or it dies. I think that anyone who has not had to suppress themselves doesn't understand the level of insecurity and fear that comes with expressing yourself authentically when you finally can. I met someone recently who grew up with very accepting parents. They allowed their children to be who they were without judgment, without trying to change them. And this person was bisexual, and they were lamenting that they never got to have a coming out, that they just always were and everyone knew it and accepted it. They never had to do some big dramatic I'm gay, and they were saying they were sad that they missed out on that. And it blew my mind to be that invested in the drama, but that you grew up with that safety of being able to be whoever you were, and you wish that you hadn't. It was a little mind-blowing to me to hear that, because I think that most people in the LGBTQ plus community wish that they never had to come out, that they could have just been, that it was never something they had to hide, it was never something they had to suppress, it was never something they had to pretend like they weren't. And as I said, there is a level of misunderstanding and disconnect that happens when you have always been safe to be who you are. People should always be safe to be who they are. Should never be a threat to your safety to just exist. And I think that we would be very dishonest if we did not hold the evangelical church and organizations like Focus on the Family accountable for these violent acts. I literally grew up hearing, whenever there were situations that happened like Club Q or abortion clinic bombings or any other things such as that, my parents would say, God is judging them. You can't run away from God. And they would always say, we don't condone doing that. God doesn't call us to violence, but He will use people to accomplish His will. My dad used to preach sermons on how God used wicked nations to punish those who were also wicked, like the children of Israel. Whenever they were being rebellious or falling away, He would use a wicked nation to punish them. And He would say, God uses wicked people to punish those who are doing evil. It doesn't have to make sense. I know it doesn't make sense, but that's what He preached. And I just remember every time there was some violence like that, just feeling so sad at the violence and the loss of life and the injuries, and having to pretend like I wasn't, because they were evil people who deserved what they got. And I never understood that. I could never wrap my head around that condoning of violence and hate. And I think that you see that a lot in the evangelical church. I know I have, growing up in it. They'll fully say, oh, we don't support doing this, but those people got what they deserved. And you cannot say that's what needed to happen to a congregation full of people and not expect that there's someone in there who will take it upon themselves to be the righteous hand of God delving out punishment. Because that's what's happening. It is people empowered by the idea that they are right and these other people are wrong. And because they are living in opposition to the ultimate truth, the Bible, they deserve to die. We have empowered generations of violent men to hurt those who don't think like them. And we did it in the pews of the church. I have heard it over and over and over and over again my entire life. And it's time to stop pretending that anything else is happening. The evangelical church constantly has a persecution complex that everyone's wanting to get rid of God, and everyone's wanting to get rid of the Bible, and everyone's wanting to get rid of their way of life. No, we just want you to recognize that you're not the only one. There are other ways to live, and you don't get to dictate how everyone else lives just because you think you're right. I was brainwashed into this idea that the Bible is the inspired word of God, pieced together by his hands through men, and handed down to us in perfection. As I moved away from trying to please my parents in everything that I did, and I started deconstructing, trying to figure out which of the Bible was truth of the things that I believed, and which of it was just stuff they had made up and piecemealed together to justify their abuse. I found myself questioning the integrity of the Bible. It was never something that I set out to do. It was never something I intended to do. It was never something I anticipated happening. I never intended to leave the church. I just wanted to figure out what God really wanted me to do and what the Bible really said, because I knew I had been fed a bunch of lies that were based in the Bible. And as I tried to deconstruct that, I ended up deconstructing my entire faith. Because when you critically look at the compilation of the Bible, it is impossible to continue to hold it up as the infallible, inspired word of God. It's a nice book with some nice thoughts and some very not nice thoughts. It is not as cohesive and non-contradictory within itself as the church would have you believe. But that takes a critical look. And it was one of the hardest things that I ever did, because the Bible was the one thing that I had always held on to. But when you are raised in purity culture, things have to be deconstructed and dismantled if you are going to live a healthy life. So for those listening who may not know what purity culture is, purity culture was a movement in the evangelical church through the 80s and 90s, and still continues to this day, not in the fervor that it did at that time, but it is an anti-sex movement. And no one will tell you that, but that is what it is. The purity culture movement is a very puritanical mindset that sex is bad unless you are married, and any thoughts of sex are bad unless you are married, and any feelings of sexual desire are bad unless you are married. And if you are a woman, you are supposed to be this pious, pure, virginal entity with absolutely no thoughts of sex, nothing but purity, pure thoughts, clean white slate, until you get married, and then you're supposed to be your husband's dirty little slut for the rest of your life, with no experience and no discussion of it, and no one telling you anything about how to do any of that or any practice. You just go from I have no idea what sex is to I'm gonna do everything all the time. It is a extreme condensing of it, but that is kind of the basis of it. Purity culture definitely focused on women more than men as far as controlling behaviors. Has a lot to do with dress. I remember sitting in teen classes and groups and reading articles written for Christian teens that talked about how not to sit so that you don't cause your brother to stumble. That's one of their favorite things. You don't want to cause your brother to stumble. Favorite thing to say. So you don't want to sit, with your legs in a certain position. You don't want to sit too wide-legged or, whatever. Pants or no pants, doesn't matter. Whether it's a pants or a dress, you don't want to sit too wide-legged because it's suggestive. And you don't want to cause your brother to stumble. And don't put things in your mouth, unless you're eating, don't chew on a pen or pencil or anything like that, because you might cause your brother to stumble. Be careful with how you do your hair, how you're flipping your hair. You don't want to do your makeup too, sultry looking, because then they're going to think you're a slut and you're easy. Basically just be dowdy, small, mousy kind of person. And the entire reason for that is because you don't want to cause your brother to stumble, because the entire principle behind it is that women need love and men need respect. And men are sexual animals with insatiable, uncontrollable sex drives, and women are supposed to keep them from exercising that until they're married. And then women have the responsibility to make sure that they have an outlet to express it. That's purity culture in a nutshell. And again, the damaging nature of growing up with that mentality that it's your responsibility to control someone else's thoughts and behavior. Because that's what purity culture is. You got to control the boys, because the boys can't control themselves. The weight of that responsibility and the fear that puts in your mind about the nature of boys and men is immeasurable. Because you can't tell girls, men are creatures with insatiable sex drives that they can't control, and they will get it wherever they can get it if you don't give it to them, and then expect them to trust them. Because you can't. You can't trust someone who can't control themselves. And especially as boys were told the same thing, they never learned to control themselves. They didn't have to. It wasn't their responsibility. It was the girl's responsibility. So if he, assaulted her, if he raped her, if he made moves on her, if he talked her out of her better judgment, well, it was her fault. Because she was wearing that dress, or she was sitting that way, or she didn't stop him. And if you think that purity culture has not crossed over into our justice system, then you've probably never had to report a rape or know anyone who has. Because that's exactly what they tell rape victims. What were you wearing? What did you say? Did you encourage him? We have given the evangelical church entirely too much power in our society and in our government. And it is time that we recognize that and rein it in. Because that's what they want. They want total control and total power. They want to be able to make the laws, to enforce the laws, and ensure that we are living in a Christian nation. To ensure that they have special rights and that anyone who is not a Christian is a second-class citizen at best and worthy of the death penalty at worst. I can't count how many times I have heard preached that homosexuality should be illegal, that our government should be taking care of this problem, that it should carry the death penalty, that if our government was doing what God set it out to do, we wouldn't have all these gays in this country. And they'll be the downfall of the country. This is not a light matter. It is not something that can be overlooked. It is not something we can just learn to get along. Because it's one thing to disagree. It's another thing if you think I should be dead because I don't believe like you do. Those are very different things. I think that as a community, we need to work a little harder on supporting each other and on being honest about the truth of those who are not on our side. That it's not just that we have a disagreement. It's not just that we believe a little differently. They don't think we should exist. They call us an abomination. And if little girls can't even be free to tell their parents who they love because they might get killed by their parents if they did so, certainly adults are not safe either. And we need to talk about this more. It's so far from just intolerance. It is genocide waiting to happen. That's a very heavy note to end on, but I thank you for listening, and I hope you will join me on the next episode as we both work on our mosaic in progress.